In the small town of Bethlehem, life was simple, yet forgiving. Naomi, a warm-hearted woman, lived there with her husband, Elimelech, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Bethlehem, meaning house of bread, was now plagued by a famine, leaving its people hungry and desperate. The land could no longer yield sustenance, and in the face of scarcity, Elimelech made the difficult choice to leave their home. As they journeyed into Moab, a foreign land, Naomi worried but held on to hope. She felt deeply the pain of leaving behind her community, her heritage, and the land that held her ancestors. Yet she walked beside her family, clinging to the love that sustained her and the hope for better days. Settling into life in Moab was not easy. The culture was different, the people unfamiliar, but Naomi and her family adapted over time. Elimelech worked hard, and their lives began to feel stable again. However, life soon took a tragic turn. Elimelech fell ill and, despite Naomi's care, he passed away, leaving her a widow in an unfamiliar land. With a broken heart, Naomi mourned her husband, feeling alone despite her son's presence. She held on to them tightly, seeking solace in their love and companionship. Her strength wavered, but she resolved to live on, for the sake of her boys. As time passed, Mahlon and Chilion found love in Moabite women. Mahlon married Ruth, a gentle, kind-hearted woman, while Chilion married Orpah, a woman of grace and warmth. Naomi welcomed these women into her family, feeling joy and love blossom in her heart again. However, the thought of her sons marrying outside of her faith weighed on Naomi. Yet she came to love Ruth and Orpah dearly, thankful that they brought new life and laughter into their home. She began to feel that perhaps Moab was where they were meant to be, after all. Naomi's hopes for peace and happiness in Moab were again shattered when tragedy struck. Both Mahlon and Chilion grew ill, and despite the care given to them, they both died, leaving Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah as widows. The grief was overwhelming, and Naomi felt her heart breaking all over again. Her last bonds of family were gone. In her mourning, Naomi felt abandoned, questioning why so much suffering had befallen her. She knew that Ruth and Orpah were young and still had lives ahead of them. They could start anew if they stayed in Moab. But for Naomi, there was nothing left in this foreign land. She decided that it was time to return to Bethlehem, to whatever remained of her old life. With a heavy heart, Naomi called Ruth and Orpah to her. She told them of her decision to return to Bethlehem and urged them to stay in Moab. "Go back to your mother's homes," she pleaded. "May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to the dead and to me. Find new husbands and build new lives." Orpah, though heartbroken, agreed to Naomi's wish. She kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, tears streaming down her face, and returned to her family. But Ruth refused to leave, vowing to stay by Naomi's side. Naomi urged her to reconsider, but Ruth's response was steadfast. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." And so, Naomi and Ruth journeyed back to Bethlehem. The journey was long and filled with uncertainty, but Ruth's loyalty gave Naomi strength. She began to see Ruth not just as a daughter-in-law, but as a true companion, someone who would share in her sorrows and joys. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the townspeople were astonished to see Naomi again. They remembered her as a lively woman, full of warmth and joy, but now she appeared worn and tired. They whispered among themselves, wondering what had befallen her in Moab. Naomi heard their whispers and, in her grief, spoke aloud to them. "Do not call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Naomi, whose name meant pleasant, now wanted to be called bitter, reflecting the hardship she had endured. She felt as though God had abandoned her, and her sorrow became part of her very identity. Ruth watched silently, understanding Naomi's pain but remaining steadfast in her support, her presence a quiet comfort to Naomi's aching soul. With no possessions and no family to rely upon, Naomi and Ruth began their lives in Bethlehem in poverty. They had to find a way to survive, and Ruth took it upon herself to provide for them. She suggested going to the fields to gather leftover grain during the harvest. Naomi agreed, grateful for Ruth's initiative. Ruth worked tirelessly in the fields, gleaning what she could to bring food to their table. Naomi saw the sacrifices Ruth made and felt a spark of hope that perhaps, through Ruth's dedication, life would find a way to bloom again. While working in the fields, Ruth caught the eye of Boaz, a kind and influential man who was also a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. Boaz noticed Ruth's diligence and kindness, and he was moved by her loyalty to Naomi. He instructed his workers to leave extra grain for Ruth to gather, allowing her to take more home. Ruth returned to Naomi with an abundance of grain, and Naomi immediately recognized Boaz's name. She realized that Boaz was a close relative and could be their kinsman redeemer, someone who had the right to protect and marry a widow to preserve the family line. Naomi saw a glimmer of hope. Naomi began to think of a way to secure Ruth's future. She instructed Ruth to dress in her best clothes and go to the threshing floor at night, where Boaz would be resting. Naomi told Ruth to lie at his feet and wait. It was a gesture of humility and a way to signal that Ruth sought his protection and care. Ruth followed Naomi's instructions, trusting in her mother-in-law's wisdom. As Ruth lay at Boaz's feet, she felt a mixture of hope and fear, not knowing what the future held. When Boaz awoke and found Ruth at his feet, he was surprised but understood her request. Ruth asked him to spread his garment over her, a symbolic act requesting his protection and proposing marriage. Boaz was moved by Ruth's loyalty and kindness and saw her as a woman of virtue. However, Boaz explained that there was another man, a closer relative, who had the first right to marry Ruth. He promised to resolve the matter quickly and do everything he could to ensure her future. True to his word, Boaz approached the other man to discuss the possibility of redeeming Elimelech's land and marrying Ruth. However, when the man learned he would also need to marry Ruth, he declined, fearing it would jeopardize his own inheritance. With the path clear, Boaz claimed his right to marry Ruth and redeem Elimelech's property. His integrity and commitment to doing the right thing, despite the potential cost, marked him as a man of honor. Boaz and Ruth were married, and their union brought joy not only to themselves but to Naomi as well. After years of sorrow and loss, Naomi finally felt a sense of peace and happiness return to her life. Ruth's love and loyalty had transformed Naomi's bitterness into joy, and she felt her heart warm again. In time, Ruth gave birth to a son, whom they named Obed. Naomi held her grandson close, feeling as though a part of her lost family had been restored. She cared for him with a grandmother's love, watching him grow and thrive, a living testament to the hope that had carried her through her darkest days. The townspeople celebrated with Naomi, rejoicing that the Lord had not forgotten her after all. Her story became one of redemption and restoration, and she could finally let go of the bitterness that had once consumed her. Obed grew to become the father of Jesse, who would later father David, the future king of Israel. Naomi's lineage became one of great significance, as David's line would ultimately lead to Jesus, according to Christian tradition. In Naomi's life, there had been deep sorrow and loss, but also unwavering loyalty, love, and redemption. Ruth's loyalty, Boaz's kindness, and Naomi's resilience formed a legacy that would endure, showing that faith and love could restore what was lost, and even the bitterest heart could find sweetness again.